Does anyone know what we're going to be talking about today? Yeah. How'd you know? Well, we're in session 2, and so you can find your within your alpha book this very section, and I will be following segments of it. And so, if you would like, have that out. And I apologize. Does anyone need a pen or a pencil? You do? Harold does. Kenny, would you mind getting him? Does anyone else need a pen or a pencil? Okay. And then lastly, is everyone good temperature-wise? Not too cold? Okay. I am always extremely warm, and so we'll go by your temperature and not mine. This morning, someone said, "Oh, it's freezing in the church." And I was like, I didn't even realize it, you know? And I tell you, I don't touch the air conditioning. I think it's somebody feels really bad for me, and so you get. And
yes,
so,
yes, we do.
Yeah.
We see you up there sweating.
So, but if we ever need to turn up in the church, just see. No, Chris Yates is in here. Just see one of the ushers, and we can get that adjusted. But with that being said, please continue to eat. You'll have time to fellowship in your groups. And if you need to use the restroom or get more beverages, please feel free to do so. But we're looking at this question, who is Jesus? And the question comes, what evidence is there for Christianity? You know, in our culture, there's seemingly a war going on between science and faith. Science it's kind of won the day since the Enlightenment. It is cold, hard fact. And when we look at faith, or various religions, we think, well, you know, these are more like a value system. They're not really factual. But what you actually discover is that the Bible is very factual, and it grounds itself in facts. And so that's part of what we're going to look at today. Science, we see, explains how and when, but not why and who. For example, what do you all see right there?
Breakfast.
Breakfast. Yes. Now, science can tell us what the ingredients are, and how it was made, and even when it was made, but not who made it or why. What we all know is that the Creator is Sharon Vineyard, and she made it for us to enjoy. Similarly, absolutely. Similarly, only the Creator can tell us who made us and why. What do you guys think about this? This is insane. There are people that do this. There's a guy that free climbs named Alex. What's his name? Alex.
Yeah. Starts with an H. I can't remember.
Yeah. Anyways, this is what people do for fun.
No.
And what enables him to do this? What do you think enables him to have the confidence to hang?
Faith.
Faith in what?
He's not going to fall. Faith in his equipment.
Well, yeah, I'm saying his ability. He doesn't even have the equipment, does he? He's just holding on. Faith is only as good as the object in which it is placed. And so what you see is you have these rock climbers who are able to do these things where you're like, that is nuts. But they're able to do it because they look, and if you, the guy that I referenced, Alex, he climbed, I'm going to forget the rock. El Capitan, yeah. If you listen to him talk, he said that he mapped it out in his mind. He spent weeks climbing it, and he said he knew every move all the way up. What was he doing? He was building confidence so that he could climb up it. You see, we all have faith.
Alex Honnold.
Alex Honnold. Thank you. Appreciate that. Atheists have faith that there is no God. However, that can't be proven mathematically or scientifically. Some have faith only in the material world. Those who believe in Jesus do so based on the evidence. I wouldn't just put my faith blindly into anything. And when it comes to Christ, I put my faith in Him partly because of the historical evidence. And that's what I mean when the Bible is factual. It lists things. Like, for example, do you all know who was ultimately responsible for the capital punishment carried out against Jesus Christ? We say his name every week. Pontius Pilate. Now, do you think we're just, you know, the gospel writers are just being flowery? You know, let's just throw in a Roman governor here. No. It's a source citation. They're saying, don't believe me. This was the guy. You see that? Because factual evidence is important. The same thing happens in court, doesn't it? Juries do the same thing. They examine the evidence and come to a conclusion. I came to believe in God because of the historical person, Jesus Christ. The resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that this world has a creator, and that that creator is to be seen through the lens of Jesus. If there is a God, and God wanted to reveal himself, the best way to do so would be to do so personally, in a way that we can understand. So, what is the evidence then, right? To build up the case, well, Jesus really did exist. We have evidence outside of the New Testament. We have Roman historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius. We have Josephus, who was a first century Jewish historian. He said, there was about the Son Jesus, a doer of wonderful works. And he went on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. We also have evidence within the New Testament. But how can we know that what we have in the Bible is trustworthy? Well, the answer is textual criticism. Textual criticism shows us that the more manuscripts you have, and the older those manuscripts are, the more trustworthy they are at giving us what the original manuscript said. You see what I'm saying? Because if I wrote something and people copied it, and this is like 2,000 years from now, the more manuscripts that you had that were copies of my original, the more you can be certain that it was actually similar to what the original said. And I'll explain what I'm talking about here a little bit better. How does the New Testament measure up to this standard? And I don't know if you guys can see this because the lights are really throwing a glare here. But for example, and you should have this in your alpha booklets, right? We have several pieces of ancient literature, right? You have Herodotus writing in 488 BC, right? And his writings, the earliest copy that we had is 8900. Okay, so the earliest copy of what he originally wrote in 488 BC, the earliest copy is 900. So that's a time lapse of 1,300 years. You see what I'm saying? How many copies of his writings do we have? We have 8 copies. Okay, well, Caesar's Gallic War, let's move up about 4 or 5 centuries. That would have been written somewhere between 58 and 50 BC. There are, let's see, the earliest manuscript that we have is 900 AD. And so there's a time gap of 950 years. And how many copies do we have? 9 to 10. Now let's go to the New Testament. That was written, between 40 and 100 AD. The earliest manuscripts that we have are dated from 130 AD, right? And so that's only a time gap of about, 30 years. And then the question is how many copies do we have? Well, we have 5,000 manuscripts in Greek. We have 10,000 in Latin. And we have 9,300 in other languages. And so let me do this. Kenny, would you dim the lights for me? This is something that I love and I find very helpful. Turn this all the way up. This is dealing with the very question I'm talking about. Do we have the original message of the New Testament is the question.
Have you ever heard someone claim that the Bible's been through so many changes and so many revisions that we really can't know what the original message was? Let's see some coffee beans illustrate a major problem with that argument. And what we're going to do is look at the manuscript evidence for some ancient writings compared to the manuscript evidence for the New Testament. That is, we're going to be looking at the handwritten copies made before the days of the printing press for each of these works. For example, for Tacitus, he wrote his famous work called Annals around the year AD 100. And the earliest copy we have for that comes from about 750 years later. So there's a 750-year gap between when it was written and our earliest copy. How many copies do we have? Just 2. So let's put 2 beams in this cup to represent our manuscripts. For Plato's dialogues, there's a 1,200-year gap, and we have just 7 copies. For the history by Herodotus, there's a 1,300-year gap with just 9 copies. And we have 10 copies of Caesar's Gallic Wars after a 900-year gap. Now, very few people question whether we have the original message of these writings, yet they constantly attack the Bible on this point. And yet the manuscript evidence we have for these is so minimal, and the gap between when they were written and when the earliest copies come from is enormous. So what about the New Testament? Well, it was written in the 1st century AD, and the earliest manuscript evidence we have for it comes within 50 years of that time. Now, how many copies do we have? Well, there are nearly 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and they average about 400 pages should use a bigger copy. But you know what? That's just the Greek manuscript. When we copy other languages like Latin, Coptic, and Armenian, there's another 20,000 manuscripts. As I mentioned earlier, critics and skeptics regularly question whether we have the original message of these writings, and yet they frequently attack the Bible on this point. You know, it really just shows their bias. But when we look at the evidence before us, we see that their arguments really don't amount to a hill of beans.
I think it's important to demonstrate that because you will hear people that will raise into question the trustworthiness of the scriptures. You can turn the lights back on if that's okay, Kenny.
And so they take Herodotus as proven fact, even though there's a 900
Yeah, 900-year gap.
900-year gap.
Yes, and there's no historian that doubts what is said. But when it comes to Christianity, I mean, there are so many manuscripts, and so this notion that, you know, they were changed over time, well, we could go back to the manuscripts and see, well, how different are the manuscripts than what we have today? And what we see is they're not different at all. It really doesn't make any sense why they would be different. Because if you're making a lie, why put your faith in Christ at all? Why does this matter? Because facts matter, right? It's not a matter of science has won the day and we're just, you know, we just have these warm, fluffy feelings. No. We base partly our faith on the evidence. And when you look at the evidence, as you saw Tim Shirky teach, it is overwhelming. And I hope that gives you confidence in the faith that you have in Christ. So, who do we put our faith in? As you guys pointed out, is this man Jesus. We know from evidence, both outside and inside the New Testament, that Jesus existed. But the question comes, who is he? Though many would agree that he was an historic figure, they doubt his claims to deity, saying that he was only a good and moral teacher. This, by and large, has won the day in the West, in our culture. But is that conclusion tenable? Let's look at two questions. Number one, what did Jesus say about himself? And number two, what evidence is there to support his claims? And so, let's see what he taught about himself. He was the focus of his teaching. Like if you study through the Gospels, he is talking about himself. He says, I am the bread of life, John 6:35. He says, I am the light of the world, in John chapter 8. Last week, from John 14, we studied, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. This language is not what we would find in the other great religious leaders, like Buddha or Muhammad. Jesus, who personified humility. Everyone says, oh, he's a humble man. He said about himself, come to me. And he said, if you receive me, you will receive God. This is Matthew chapter 10 and Matthew 11. It's like this. I love this story. There was a child drawing a picture, and the teacher came up and said, what are you drawing? He said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And she said, well, no one's seen God. You can't, make out what he looks like. How could this be? And he said, just give me a moment and I'll finish, and you will see. Jesus was saying, if you see me, you have seen God. Look at his indirect claims. He claims to forgive sins. And I know that sometimes when I teach or preach, I'll say things and it doesn't hit home. And so let me give you a good illustration. Any good illustration allows a window into it. Say, for example, Tom, and let's see here, Jonathan. Tom and Jonathan, you guys get upset because you want more of Sharon's amazing food, and you get into a fight. And Jonathan, you punch Tom, right? And then I have to do something, right? Because when anything like that happens, you know who they're going to look to? The guy who's in charge. And they're like, man, you got to deal with this. And imagine if I went up to the situation and I looked at Jonathan and Tom and I said, Tom, it's okay. I have forgiven Jonathan. Tom's going to be like, well and good, Matt, but I was the one that was injured. And what we see Jesus doing is he would enter into those situations and he would say, I have forgiven you. And what we see is like when we sin against somebody, we're not just sinning against the person, we're ultimately sinning against God.
Right.
And when God was in his earthly ministry, he was going around saying, I forgive you. Which doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless he really is God. And look at the audacity of those claims. And so when he says, I forgive you, you need to understand the gravity of what he is suggesting. But second, we also look at his direct claims. We see that he claims to be the Messiah. He rode into Jerusalem, right, on Palm Sunday, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9, right, the donkey, the foal of a donkey. He claims to be the Son of God, from Mark 14. He said, I and the Father are one, John 10, verse 30. In John 8, when he was having a conversation of whose father was, whom, you remember John chapter 8, the Jewish leadership said, our father is Abraham. And Jesus said, no, your father is Satan. and he says to him, before Abraham was, I am. And you notice that Jesus has all these I am statements. The reason he is saying that is because in Greek it's the ego eimi. In the Hebrew, this is the covenantal name that God gave to Moses. If you remember from Exodus 2 or 3, God calls Moses to go and set his people free, to go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses is like, well, who should I tell him is, sending me? And he says, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is the Hebrew. Asher, Aha, Asher, I think is the actual Hebrew. And it is, I am who I am. And so what we get is, I am. That is the covenantal name. And so when you read in the Old Testament and you read the word, the Lord, that is actually God's covenantal name, which was such a holy name that none of the Jews actually ever said the word aloud. And so this is the covenantal name. And so Jesus shows up and he is saying, I'm that God, right? I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection life. I am the way, the truth, and life. Do you see? He's making no bones about who he is. And so the Jewish leaders, what did they do? And we see that they knew what he was claiming because it says that they picked up rocks to stone him. Why would they do that? Because if he wasn't God, he was blaspheming. And it was a capital offense. Of course, it was only blaspheming if he wasn't God. But he was proclaiming that he was God. I believe that if you look at the evidence, you will conclude that Jesus did proclaim to be God. Well, what do we do with such a claim? Well, there are only three options. And this is, you all, if you don't know this yet, you'll find my love of C.S. Lewis. This is his trilemma. He says, when you come to Jesus Christ, you only have three options. He was either a liar, a lunatic, or he was Lord of all. And this, of course, comes from mere Christianity, and I'll read this to you. He says, a man who is merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher, as the West largely believes. He would either be insane, and I don't put this in there, but I love it, insane on the level of a poached egg, is what he said. Or else, he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else something worse. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Well, what evidence is there that supports his claims? Well, first, his teaching. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do unto you. And he is the first person in human history to say, love your enemy. Right?
Yeah.
Very difficult for us Westerners, right? We don't want to love our enemy. We want to take them down, right?
Right.
But this is the stuff that he was teaching. Now, we have advanced in science and technology, yet in 2,000 years, no one has improved upon the moral teaching of Jesus Christ. They are the greatest words ever spoken. They almost have the feeling that, these would be the words that God would say if he suddenly showed up. That's what we see. Second, his life. His disciples and the people around him saw him turn water into wine. He fed the hungry. Remember this story where he had, 2 loaves of bread? No.
2
2
fishes,
fishes,
5
loaves. Yeah. And he fed how many people? He said 5,000, which is a lot. But that's not taking into consideration all of the women and children. So if it was 5,000 men, that's 40,000 people with how many loaves? 2 loaves?
2 fish.
Two
2
fish.
fish.
Five
loaves.
5 loaves. Yeah,
Yes.
that's a lot better. It makes it easier to feed 40,000, right? You see this?
Right.
He healed the sick. He ultimately laid down his life for his followers. Third, his character. His enemies could find no fault. Even those that were with him, his disciples, they saw the way he lived and they never found him to ever sin at all. If you want to see someone's true character, you just need to watch them under pressure, right? And when Jesus was on the cross, what did he say? That's the ultimate form of pressure if you don't, if you never considered it. He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Fourth, the fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies in his life. 29 in one single day. The exact manner of his death, where he would be buried, his resurrection, even the place where he was to be born, he fulfilled. Now, how could he fulfill all these prophecies, the majority of which were outside of his control? I mean, can you imagine if one day he was reading and he's like, oh man, I was supposed to be born in Bethlehem. Oh, it's too late. You know? You can't. And that's why I wanted to see the evidence. Like, it is amazing once you start going through and looking at the facts. Okay. Fifth, his conquest over death, which is the cornerstone of Christianity. This conquest is so relevant to every single one of us, isn't it? Because statistically speaking, 1 out of 1 of us is going to die, right? I love what the Onion said. The Onion reported, world death rate holding steady at 100%. It's a very relevant problem that we all have. The Victorians, and I love pointing this out, the Victorians love to talk about death. And you go back and you read the literature, it's all about death. But they never talked about sex. But now, the pendulum has swung, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And what do we talk about?
Sex.
We all talk about sex. But what don't we like to talk about?
We hate
Death. That's why we marginalize it, you know. You have these assisted living, these places where, people go when they get older, and they're pushed to the side, they're pushed to the margins, right? Everyone avoids it. It's just something that we don't mention. Even hospitals try to avoid the word death. Listen to this. One hospital said to their doctors and their nurses, you must never use the word death. Listen to this. It says, instead, describe it as a negative patient outcome. Isn't that a spin?
Oh, God.
But guess what? People die. They have these negative care, outcomes. Anyways. And if you have ever been to a funeral, you will notice at least how seemingly final death is. Unless, when Jesus died and was buried, he was raised to life. If he was, then there is hope beyond the grave. There's hope beyond this life. But is it just wishful thinking? That's what a lot of people think. A lot of people in the West, they say, well, it's not factual, right? It is, unless there is evidence. And let's take a look at the evidence. The biggest point that we as Christians need to consider is the empty tomb. No one has ever satisfactorily answered why he was not there on that first Easter morning. And so there are theories. And so let's look at some of these theories. Some suggest that he did not die, or that his disciples took the body. But then follow me here. If that is the case, that means that they would all go on to die terrible deaths for a lie. And I'm sorry, in the history of man that has never happened. If someone knows it's a lie, that's going to come out very quickly. They're not going to go to their deaths proclaiming something they know not to be true. Second, well, the authorities stole the body. It was either the Romans or the Jews. This is also nonsensical, because both groups, they would be able to squelch any, uprise, any talk about these Christians by presenting the body. But guess what the Romans and the Jews never were able to do? Find the body. Third, well then someone stole the body, right? Obviously, grave robbers came in. Okay, that's valid, except they left behind the most valuable thing in the tomb, which was the grave clothes. You would not leave those, you would take them, but of course they were left, and therefore it destroys that theory as well. Well, what about the disciples? How did they respond? Did they respond saying, I know he's going to be resurrected. Let's go to the tomb and prove it?
No.
No! None of them. They were all like, doom and gloom. It's all over, right? Even the women, they went to anoint his dead body. And even when word came back that he was resurrected, do you know what they did? Do you remember what Thomas thought? He said, yeah, I'm not going to believe unless I can see his wounds, right? His hands, in his side. Then all of a sudden, these disciples who abandoned Jesus at the cross, they became stalwart believers, willing to associate with his name, be beaten, be imprisoned, and to die terrible deaths. And you have to ask, well, what was the difference? The difference was that they saw the resurrected Lord. They saw that the Redeemer lived, and they saw him face to face. And they realized, oh man, he wasn't lying when he was talking about the resurrection. And if the resurrection is true, does that change how you look at your life? If you don't think it does, then you're not considering what the physical resurrection is. It means that there is more to life than here and now, and that God has entered in and brought about resurrection in the middle of history, so that if you put your faith in him, you will still live. You will get your physical bodies back, and he is coming to restore not just our physical bodies, but the world itself, everything we love and enjoy. Okay. Immediately after this, after the disciples start, proclaiming the resurrection, Christianity takes off like wildfire, and it still continues like wildfire today, with over 2.3 billion Christians in the world. And Christians still speak of encountering the risen Jesus. Back to the two questions. What did Jesus say, and what evidence is there? When we look at the two questions, I think it is clear that Jesus did claim to be God. Was he deluded, or was he a fraud? When I look at the evidence of his teaching, life signs, fulfillment of prophecy, and resurrection, it seems to me that it requires more faith to not believe in his claims than to actually believe them. Again, there is a difference between head and heart knowledge. It's a difference between knowing and experiencing. Jesus really is who he claims to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There really is hope beyond this life. And my encounter with Jesus totally changed my life, and it can change yours as well. And next week, we're going to tackle the question of, why did Jesus die? But right now, I want